Hey everyone, let's dive right into today's explainer and unpack a question that's constantly in the news. Exactly why isn't Washington, D.C. a state? We hear this debate all the time, but today we're actually going to peel back the layers and analyze the foundational blueprint. We're going to uncover the precise historical and legal reasons the founders drew the capital's map the way they did and why that centuries-old framework still dictates things today.
To really understand the source material, we'll be moving chronologically today. We'll start with a crazy post-revolutionary crisis, look at the Constitution's actual blueprint, and then wrap up with modern compromises and the current legal debate.
All right, Section 1. The 1783 Pennsylvania Mutiny, or the crisis that literally sparked our federal district.
Picture this. It's June 1783. The Revolutionary War is essentially over, but the newly formed national government is completely broke and hasn't been able to pay its continental soldiers. So on June 20th, a mob of about 400 angry, armed, and unpaid soldiers literally surrounded the State House in Philadelphia where Congress was meeting. They demanded their back pay at gunpoint. In a total panic, Congress pleaded with the Pennsylvania state government to deploy their militia for protection, but get this, Pennsylvania just flat out refused. Left entirely defenseless by the very state hosting them, Congress was forced to flee their own country's soldiers and run to Princeton, New Jersey, where they had to operate as a provisional government for months.
So what's the big takeaway here? Well, the founders learned a really harsh lesson from this embarrassment. They realized that the federal government absolutely must have its own neutral ground. Think about it. If the seat of national power relies on a single state for its safety and security, it's fundamentally vulnerable. This intense need for independence became the primary driver for everything that followed.
Moving into Section 2, the constitutional blueprint, and how they went about designing that neutral ground.
To make absolutely sure a mutiny situation never happened again, the founders wrote the Enclave Clause right into the Constitution. This explicitly granted Congress the power to carve out a distinct, separate area to serve as the seat of government, totally free from state control. And notice the very specific wording here, not exceeding 10 miles square. In the language of the founders, that meant 10 miles on each side, placing a strict physical limit on the district at a maximum of 100 square miles. Inside this zone, Congress would have exclusive legislation, guaranteeing no state could ever deny them protection or hold the federal government hostage again.
This whole idea brilliantly illustrates James Madison's philosophical intent. The father of the Constitution specifically warned against placing the national capital inside any particular state. In Federalist 43, Madison argued that if the federal government depended on a state, it could lead to what he called awe or influence. Essentially, a host state could uniquely pressure, manipulate, or intimidate the federal system if it didn't get its way. To keep the balance among all members of the Union, the capital simply had to stand apart.
Now, it's important to note this massive shift didn't just happen overnight. First came the 1790 Residence Act, where Maryland and Virginia officially handed over the land. And during that transitional phase, the residents living there actually continued to vote as Marylanders or Virginians, but that was temporary. The 1801 Organic Act is when Congress officially executed the constitutional design and took direct administrative authority over the district. That was the exact moment those residents formally lost their state-based direct representation in Congress. So, legally speaking, the constitutional framework basically glues direct representation to statehood. The Constitution explicitly says members of the House and Senate are chosen by the people of the several states, meaning those living in a federal district just don't legally qualify for the standard 2 senators and a representative package. Direct representation is constitutionally tethered to residing within a recognized state.
All right, Section 3. Let's look at representation, compromises, and how we navigate this in the modern political landscape.
You hear the phrase taxation without representation thrown around a lot in this debate. When we look at that argument, it's really helpful to compare D.C. to U.S. territories based on our source material. Residents of Puerto Rico and Guam, for example, are U.S. citizens who pay certain federal taxes, like payroll taxes, but they also lack direct representation in Congress because they don't live in a recognized state. This comparison suggests that, legally, statehood, rather than your tax bracket, is the constitutional gateway to full congressional representation.
Now, think about the number 3. This represents the 3 electoral votes granted to D.C. by the 23rd Amendment. Ratified back in 1960, this was a massive, unique compromise. It gave residents of this relatively small federal district a direct say in electing the president.
The amendment ensures D.C. gets no more votes than the least populous state, effectively capping them at 3.
Building on that momentum, we have the 1970 D.C. Delegate Act, which showcases another major modern compromise. Sure, D.C. doesn't have U.S. senators or a final House floor vote, but their House delegates still wield significant legislative power. Legally recognized as a congressperson, they can introduce legislation, dive into debate, and sit on critical committees.
Today, D.C. sits at exactly 68 square miles. While proponents of statehood often point to the district's population size, our source outlines a built-in geographic counterargument. Because the area is so small, residents who prioritize direct congressional representation above absolutely everything else have a highly viable option: simply move a few miles into neighboring Virginia or Maryland. By doing that, they immediately gain full representation without having to alter the constitutional structure of the capital itself.
Let's head into our final section, Section 4, and unpack the statehood counter-arguments against becoming the 51st state.
So, a lot of modern statehood proposals don't actually suggest eliminating the federal district entirely. Instead, they propose a capital core plan. This means shrinking the federal zone down to just 2 square miles covering the White House, the Capitol, and the National Mall, and then turning the remaining 66 square miles into a brand new 51st state. The pushback here is pretty fascinating. First, keeping a 2 square mile core admits that a neutral federal district is fundamentally necessary. But more importantly, it creates a severe structural entanglement. Unlike other states that host scattered federal buildings, this new state would physically wrap around the entire nerve center of the U.S. government, risking the exact kind of awe and influence Madison explicitly warned us about.
And this brings up a wild legal paradox. You see, creating a state out of the surrounding 66 square miles doesn't automatically repeal the 23rd Amendment. Amending the Constitution is an entirely separate, notoriously lengthy process. So, if the remaining 2 square mile federal core constitutionally holds on to 3 electoral votes, who gets them? Essentially, just the president and their family living in the White House. It's a pretty glaring constitutional flaw in immediate statehood proposals.
Another alternative you'll hear about is retrocession, giving the land back to Maryland, kind of like how the area west of the Potomac was given back to Virginia in 1846. But the explainer outlines 3 massive constitutional and logistical hurdles, making this super unlikely today. Step 1. The Maryland state legislature would have to officially agree to absorb the territory. Step 2. D.C. citizens would have to actually vote and agree to become Marylanders, which is heavily debated. And Step 3, you'd have to untangle the absolute logistical nightmare of merging an independent city government into an established state infrastructure.
Finally, let's look at who actually calls the shots locally. In 1973, the D.C. Home Rule Act gave residents the right to elect their own mayor and local councils. However, Congress retained the ultimate constitutional authority to override those local laws. Take a recent example that really highlights this ongoing tension. D.C.'s local government passed legislation allowing non-citizens to vote in local elections. While federal law prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections, D.C.'s local rule created a completely different standard in the Capitol. This kind of clash perfectly illustrates exactly why the founders designed a hierarchical system where Congress retains the final, ultimate authority over the federal seat.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to consider this massive balancing act. On one side, we have the very real, modern push for direct congressional representation for those residing in the Capitol. But on the other side, we have a centuries-old constitutional blueprint designed explicitly to keep the federal seat neutral, secure, and totally free from the influence of any single state. So how do we balance these 2 valid perspectives moving forward? If you found this deep dive explainer helpful, please remember to turn on those English captions and absolutely hit like, share, and subscribe for more structured explainers. See you next time.